Ordinary people doing extraordinary things with me, Mark Christie.
This morning I'm here with Tony Slade, the Garagiste in Ipswich. So, morning, Tony.
Good morning.
Well, perhaps you could just explain your business and your love for the 2CV.
Yeah, it goes back a long way. Originally, when I went to France when I was 13, I went on a school exchange. I'd never been out of East Anglia. We stayed in a place on the bottom of the Alps, and it was all very dramatic, and I loved it. But in that process, I saw my first 2CV, and I thought, how strange. Couldn't work it out. Fell in love with the culture and the food, and came back to Britain a changed kid, really.
Yeah.
And then life evolved, and I trained as a civil engineer, and got married and children and bits and pieces. But I never lost that feeling for something so fundamentally basic. And then I did a bit of research, and I found it really, I like the French culture. It's very interesting. But there are basically three car manufacturers, Renault, Citroën and Peugeot. Peugeot ran hardware shops and things like this, and they had that sort of attitude to life. And Renault were accountants, and so they had their attitude to life. And Citroën was a wild man. Yeah. And he didn't really give a damn about making a profit. He'd sign contracts to get what he wanted, and he eventually got in quite a mess and lost control of the company to Michelin, because he just projected, I would make so many cars and this and this and this. So they signed contracts, but he didn't notice the small print. But what was interesting about him, he set up his first factory in 1926 in Paris, and only employed women.
Wow.
He white-tiled the place, put in creche facilities and everything else. He just had a different approach to life. So this got me very interested. And then in 1934 in France, there was a socialist government came in, which is very unusual for France, Front Populaire. Only there for 3 months. But it was a time that Europe was going through so many changes. And the car manufacturers were quite autocratic, making cars for the rich. So all across Europe, they said, no, you must make cars for the people. And in Italy, you had a little Fiat Topolino, and everybody in Volkswagen with their Beetle. And so everybody making small cars. They went to Citroën and said, you must make a small car. And they went, we do make one. And they, excuse me, no, you don't. Oh, we said, well, the car we make, we're giving it a factory code, a small car. Yeah, but it's not a small car. Well, bugger off, they said, because that's what we do. So they sent the army in and said, you will make a small car. And being French, they get very miffed and go, we don't want to know. So they put the idea out to Porsche to come up with a design and an idea. And they weren't happy with it. It wasn't good enough. They didn't feel there was an appropriate way of approaching things. So they decided to take it in-house and get on with it. And the car was called, they wouldn't give it a name. The 2CV means 2 horsepower, in the fiscal sense that we always used to tax cars on this funny rating, like Morris 8 horsepower. They weren't 8 horsepower. It was a funny little calculation. So they never did give it a name, because this was their attitude towards the French government. Okay, we're doing it, but, Then they put one man in charge and said, okay, well, that's your job. And they started to produce a few prototypes and funny things. But it was based in a way that we wouldn't understand these days. They'd have a running prototype. He'd go, right, take me out for a drive. Oh, I can't get in. And he always wore a top hat. So they made it taller. All right. And he'd go along and go, stop, take the gearbox out. That takes too long. Right, I'm going, And that's how the car was designed.
Wow.
And bearing in mind, as I remember in France all those years ago, not quite long ago as that, but the roads were pavé, very, very curved.
Yeah.
And it was like a chicken run every time. You came towards the car in the opposite direction. The roads were not finished on the side. There was miles and miles of trees with cars crashed against them. And you sort of came towards each other, and then someone had to make a decision. And the thing about the 2CV, it held the road very well. So it could slip down the wet pavé and still get past.
Right.
And this is part of the design concept of this thing, that it had to deal with the reality of French roads. And out of that came this car that everybody, when it came out, just said, what a waste of time. And it became a very, very popular car, and you had to wait years and years to get them. They just made it in one colour and said, well, that's what it is. And then people, as more colours after the war became available, people were taking their grey 2CVs and getting them resprayed in bright colours. And they thought, maybe we should make some in bright colours. And everything evolved in a sort of logical process, French logical process, to end up with this little car that seemed to satisfy what was needed for the peasants in France, really. The doctor would have a DS, and the workers would have 2CVs. And it was that simple. They only made the two cars.
Yeah.
And I remember, because I was married to a French woman for many years, and she would go out every day, midday, in the 2CV to find her husband. And they lived in Meaux, which is just sort of northeast of Paris. Huge grain fields, just miles and miles of nothingness. And she'd just drive with a bottle of wine and a loaf of bread and a bit of cheese until she found him in the 2CVs, uphill, downhill, whatever, and that was her daily routine. And the car fulfilled the function that it was designed for. So it fascinated me. So some years later, I first of all wanted a small car with four doors, and in Britain we didn't have any. They were all biggish cars, Cortinas and funny things. And I came across the Renault 4, and I thought, well, it's got 5 doors, a neat little thing. I was in South Wales at the time.
It looks a bit like the 2CV, doesn't it?
Well, yeah, very same concept, really. So I found this one for sale, and I went to buy it. And very old-fashioned, you had to cross the man's palm with silver, which it was a 50p piece or whatever. And I drove it down the mountain to find out the shock absorber was long since gone. And to stay on the track was almost impossible. You just do about 3 miles an hour. But I sorted it out and I got into it and I really enjoyed it. But then I just felt I'd like a Citroen. There's something about it. I like the ethos of Citroen. The fact the man was a purist in his approach to life. And he didn't care about capitalism or anything else. He just wanted to make what he wanted to make and the way he wanted to make it. So that sort of somehow got into my head. And I just liked that approach to life. And so I eventually found an ME6, actually, funnily enough, which was a derivative of the 2CV, which they sold in very small numbers in this country, and I bought one of those. But I still hankered after getting a 2CV, but there weren't any, they weren't sold here. So I wrote to Paris and said I'd like to buy a 2CV, and they sent it back to Citroen's headquarters in Slough to deal with it. And they wrote to me and said, this is, early mid-70s. And they said, will you please stop troubling Citroën in France? The 2CV is not sold in this country and never will be. So basically, bugger off. And 6 months later, it was brought into the country.
Excellent.
So it was quite ironic, really. And then I got involved. And I was
do you think you were responsible for that in any way?
Well, they have a funny arrangement. You have dealer conferences. So once a year, they decided which models they want to import. And suddenly they all decided they want to import the 2CV. Citroën were not happy about it, but they did. a friend of mine, a friend of mine set up a Citroen agency with another guy on the basis that he only wanted to do Citroen, so which was unusual in those days. And you had to buy the car from Citroen and put it in the showroom. So he bought in those days an Emmy, put it in the showroom, didn't sell. It was a very boring looking car. So they thought, well, we've got to do something because we've got no money now. We bought one car, and he sprayed the top of the car a different colour, a new car, and sold it straight away. And so he was off. And he was the guy that got me going. A guy called John Thiedem. He's still alive. And he ended up running Citroen DS workshops and travelling all over the country. Very interesting man. But he got me going because he used to do my 2 CVs while I was still a civil engineer. And then one day, as a civil engineer, you find if the country's going through a bad period, they stop building. All right. And I just moved to a new company, and it was actually a contractor, and they were doing some very dangerous things. So I blew the whistle on them, and they sent me down the road. But fortunately, they didn't carry on with what they were doing, and people weren't killed, which they would have been. But then I sort of went home and thought, well, I've got a wife and a house and a mortgage, and so I thought, Christ, what am I going to do? So I signed on, which is something I've never done before. And I went to see my friend John and said, look, I know you're going to do this big overhaul of my 2CV, but don't. There is no income. And I haven't got a job. And he goes, oh, well. He said, I'll tell you something. He said, I hate 2CVs. He said, I'll do it because I know how to do it, but I don't like them. And the phone rang. And he said, here's your first job. And I went, what? He said, well, this woman's car won't start. I said, I don't know anything. He said, you can change plugs, can't you? I said, just about. And he said, well, there's 2 plugs. There's a plug spanner. Off you go. I went round to see this woman. And I said, is the battery still flat? Because my 2CV is an old 6-volt one.
Yeah.
And she said, no, there's still a bit of life in it. And I got there, she's lovely. She came out and said, oh, lovely, I'm so pleased you turned up. I really can't get it started. The battery is now completely flat. Do you want a coffee? I thought, yes, I'm buying some time here. I didn't know what to do. So I changed the plugs and then got back in the car and thought, well, what do I do? So I turned the key and it went, and fired. And she came out with a coffee and said, that's absolutely brilliant. How much do I owe you? Well, I'd never seen money in my life before because I'd been paid monthly and everything else. And I just said, I don't know, 20 quid, she said, brilliant. and that was when I started.
Excellent.
And I knew that woman and then subsequently her husband and her 2 children. And this is how it developed. It was organic. Everybody knew everybody, and it's quite bizarre. So I was only a week on the dole, and there I went back in and said, look, you're wasting your money. I can earn some money. And everybody in there was going, what are you doing? What are you doing? I said, well, I don't need the money. What do you mean you don't need it? They got angry, And I thought, well, sorry, look, I don't need the money. All right, bye. I'm off. And that's how I started doing 2CVs.
I'm sure they're not very used to people doing that.
No, not at all. And people are so angry because some people cheat, some people don't, but they need the money, and for someone to come in and be so casual wasn't very good news. And so my friend John, who got me going, he'd managed to get some premises which were grim, to say the least. Corrugated iron, leaked like a sieve. There's no electricity in it, nothing at all. We worked by torchlight. And in the winter, it was hilarious because people came in, they couldn't see you. You wave a torch at them, come over, and they write the cheque by torchlight and all this sort of thing. Until we managed to, probably rather illegally, rig up an electrical supply. And we got a bulb in there, which was a big moment.
Wow.
So we had a party and cracked some champagne and switched the bulb on. Yeah. And you could see all the stalactites, I forget which is which, hanging down from the ceiling where it leaked. It was so cold. And Yes, so that's how we got off the ground, really.
And that is the premises that you're still in today?
No, that's the premises in Chelmsford.
Right.
And then things moved on, and we were quite successful in a sort of strange way. And I managed to rent 2 viaducts underneath the main railway line, which, God, were they damp.
I bet.
When you open the doors in the morning, you almost fell over.
Yeah.
You had to leave the doors open for a while before you even dare go in. It was really quite disgusting. But then I started employing other people there, and we sort of slowly got off the ground. We ran a spares shop, and we were working 7 days a week, sometimes 15 hours a day. But then we'd do 3 months, and then we'd have a month off. Just go travelling in our 2CVs to Switzerland, whatever. And we got this very sort of casual attitude, and we'd say, we'd bring up friends on a Friday night and go, "Are you doing anything the weekend?" Well, no, you know. And I remember once I said, I'll put a pin in the map. And I said, I'll sit this little village in Switzerland. It's bound to have a square. See you there at 2 o'clock tomorrow? Like, yeah. And most people would turn up.
Excellent.
One guy ended up getting drunk on the way. He started a bit early, ended up in prison in Paris. But all sorts of things went on. But it was very casual, you know. And, but then, of course, they wouldn't supply me with parts because I wasn't an official agent. So we had to go to Holland to pick up the parts, which I did in the van for quite a few years. With some very interesting people we were dealing with there. And everybody's a character, you know, it's sort of quite strange. But they didn't ever charge me export duty, and I queried it once because we needed to send more vans to get more parts. And this long-haired guy just said to me, "Are you a member of the 2CV Club?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Well, you don't pay." And it was that world, and we never did. It was a sort of hippie world.
Yeah.
Of people helped everybody else. I mean, it's in the time of before the wall came down, and we were driving through France, I think it was, and we met up with a couple of other 2CVs going to a meeting just by chance. And one of the 2CVs was a real wreck, and it turned out it belonged to a young Yugoslav couple when Yugoslavia was Yugoslavia. Yeah. And under their rules, under communists, in the final year, they were allowed 1 trip to the West. So they jumped in their 2CV and left the country, not knowing where they were going or why. But they could. So they did. And then they tailed onto other 2CVs, and we all went to this meeting somewhere, can't remember. And they're a really sweet couple. And they absolutely crashed out when they got there in this little tiny tent. And we all got together and said, what can we do for them? And so a crowd of us got together and thought, oh, this car is a wreck. And they used to make them in Yugoslavia. And one of the guys said, well, I'm a local Citroen agent. He said, I tell you what, if you're all prepared to work hard, I'll supply all the parts for free. Chassis, everything.
Wow.
And we rebuilt the whole car. We pushed it away from their little tent and put it into the marquee. And we worked all night, about 10 of us. Wow. And we completely rebuilt this car. And it was done on the bung, the new engine, everything, just crazy. And then we went and parked it outside their tent, just pushed it gently, and then we all hung around for them to wake up. Because they didn't, they were knackered, weren't they? And we come on, you know. And eventually the guy came out and he went to get something out of the car, and of course it looked the same. Yeah. But he had to move it, and he went, vroom, and he looked around in utter amazement. The car just worked instantly. Yeah. And of course we all fell about laughing. And we had a long chat. Our English wasn't very good, but we had a mixture of languages, and we got it across and said, look, don't think this will happen to everybody that comes out of Yugoslavia, but no. We just thought well, the following year, some of their friends came out with them and then ran the border, and they got shot at.
Whoa.
And we had 2CVs turning up with holes in the doors and
Wow.
but they were so impressed because they'd been told that we're all bastards. That people could be that kind and friendly, you know. And they just took the life in their hands and ran for it. So, you know, it's a funny one, but it's that ethos of where we all came from. You all help each other out. And I did one, it's funny, I used to organise international meetings, and this guy had an accident and smashed up the back of his car, and it was near my garage in Chelmsford, so I put it right for him, didn't charge him for it. And he said, I'm so grateful because it's not actually my car, it belongs to my brother-in-law. That I borrowed it for the trip, and I didn't know what to do. He said, I'm not properly insured, really, and you know, I forget where he came from, some country in Europe. Anyway, for about, it must have been another 5 years, this man came up to me eventually with this big parcel and said, "You're Tony Slade, aren't you?" I said, "Yes." And he got these very, very rare 2CV wings. And they were wrapped up in newspaper from 5 years previously. This was from the brother-in-law.
Wow.
Thank you for doing the car. You know, things went like that. You never knew what was going to happen next. But it was always done on that very human level. So I try to perpetuate that in the way I run the business. And having worked for the Greens for many years and all the rest of it, I hear an awful lot of superficial talk about the environment and things, but the reality is quite different. And I thought if we could have something sustainable, that we don't need to buy new. But of course, the pressure is on for manufacturers to keep churning out, keep the people employed.
Yeah.
Look at France, 1 in 10 people are in the car industry. There's no interest in making something that will last. But we thought, okay, we'll adopt this approach because it seemed the right approach. So that's how we've always operated, really, that you don't need to engage in the heavy world of capitalism in order to have a nice life. It's just not necessary. You're buying into their world to make their money. And so it's worked pretty well, and a lot of hard work. Don't get me wrong, things are not that easy all the time. But people work with you. Most of my customers become friends that call in casually. And it's setting up this alternative way of looking at life, which I think is very important.
Absolutely.
So there we go. That's where we are. And my
fantastic business ethos.
Well, it's the amazing thing. It's worked.
Clearly it has.
All those heavy pressures out there and the demands and the advertising and the, you know. I mean, I remember, I don't know if you remember him, Jasper Carrot used to be this comedian on television.
Yeah, I remember him.
Yeah, and he used to really take the piss out of the 2CV. He hated it. Right?
Yeah.
And then we had a magazine, it used to be, that everybody sort of read to get their judgment on whether anything was good value, called Which magazine. Right. And they castigated the 2CV and said it hasn't got a steering joint in the steering column, and therefore the column would hit you and the car shouldn't be on the road. Well, having personally had an accident and not wearing a seatbelt, it doesn't happen like that. For a start, it isn't aiming at you.
Right.
Where most steering columns actually are aiming towards you, because the steering rack is out the front and the whole thing is lined up, but the 2CV is down there and it comes sort of fairly vertical. And in that accident, I mean, I cracked 2 ribs. I went against the steering wheel. Steering wheel went through the windscreen and my head didn't. It wasn't designed like that, but it's actually remarkably safe in the event. And they're very long.
Yeah,
longer than you imagine. And the chassis goes from one bumper to one bumper. And the whole engine and gearbox disappeared under the car. I mean, it's a big impact. And I opened the door and walked out. A little bit dazed and very upset that I just serviced the car. But that's the way it goes. And they put helicopters up to find me, and I just walked into the hospital, had a check, and then went to work. So yeah, I can't say they're safe because technically they don't satisfy the regulations. But unless you get between a lorry and a wall, you're pretty safe because the suspension's so soft. When it gets hit, it just goes boing, and that's the end of that, you know. And I've dealt with hundreds of accidents, and that's always been the case. And so there we go. So I can't justify it on those grounds because they're not really acceptable. But then a lot of what I do isn't acceptable. So that's
Well, I mean, a lot of what you do is extremely interesting, though, and very valuable to your customers, I would say.
yeah, and it's trying to keep that tenuous link with how people used to behave. In a world that's become harder and harder and more selfish and dominated to an extraordinary extent by advertising, especially towards young people or women, you know, they feel trapped into this awful world of purchasing. And you really don't need to. You can still look good, have fun, you know, you don't need to join in. But of course most people do and feel compelled to do it. Yeah. I'm just hoping out of this awful pandemic will come some rethinking about what life's about. I mean, my whole I'm not a religious person by any means, but I have lots of friends who are. I mean, we're next door to a mosque, and I know them all there. You know, we have all sorts of things, and but I'm more of a sort of you expand your mind continuously. Yeah. There isn't anything to achieve beyond keep expanding your mind. There's no nirvana, there's no end to the process, which is a sort of Buddhist approach, that it is expansion of the mind. And there's no meaning of life except to try and live a good life and enjoy yourself. And that's it. I'm going to have to shoot off in a minute.
That's no problem. That's been great to talk to you.
Well, yeah, it's been quite fun, yes.
Yeah.
But I've got to go and weld a 2CV.
Well, we'll end it there then, Tony.
All right, Mark. Thank you very much.
Great stuff. Bye-bye.
I don't know how you switch it off, but I expect you do.
Many thanks to Tony Slade, and join me next time to hear another extraordinary story.